everybody a wee second just to come back from the break. We are just hitting the kind of 3:15 at the moment. Okay, so just 2 little seconds here. Okay, so I think we're ready to kind of get started again. So we're going to start with our second round of flash talk. So our first flash talk is from Jamie Pearce, if you're ready.
Thanks, Amy, very much. Hopefully you've got a few slides to share. Thank you. Yes. Hello, everybody. Nice to virtually meet you all. My name is Jamie Pearce, and I'm a geographer in the School of Geosciences, and also a co-director of the Centre for Research on Environment, Society and Health. And my interests are in the role of place in explaining health and health inequalities, including mental health related outcomes. My research is very much interdisciplinary and influenced by some great collaborators across the university and beyond in various disciplines, including epidemiology, psychiatry, psychology, demography, sociology, landscape architecture, and probably others that I can't remember off the top of my head. Amy, do you mind just moving on a slide, please? Thank you. So a lot of my work is Scotland, UK focused, but with some ongoing collaborations around the world, including in China, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and various European countries. And as the diagram at the bottom there suggests, my interest in how the places we live and we work and we age are important in understanding health, but also how places mediate broader political, social and economic processes. So, for example, I've recently completed with a colleague who's online today, Sarah Curtis, an ESRC funded study that's been looking at the financial crisis, the Great Recession, and then austerity related policies that came out of that, and the impact of all of those on mental health in Scotland. And one of the questions we've been looking at as an example is how various aspects of place buffer and mediate the impact of these broad fiscal issues. Methodologically, the work we do in our team is mixed, lots of different methods, quant and qual, but we've got a particular interest in the use of linked and integrated administrative data, the use of birth cohorts and surveys, but perhaps most uniquely here, the use of geospatial geographical data integrated with various health and administrative data sets to answer questions about the relationship between places and health. If you mind moving on to the next slide, please. So now let's give a quick taster of 3 brief examples of some empirical research we've been up to. One theme we've been looking at is the impact of place-based crime, local crime, but particularly some work that a postdoc working in our team, Gergo Brani, has been leading on. And we've been using Scottish and European-wide data and using linked, self-reported health service data and also prescription data as indicators of mental health. And as systematic review we carried out quite recently shows, there's quite strong, robust evidence that neighbourhood crime is an important predictor of mental health. But it's also clear that the choice of the outcome, the way in which mental health is captured, is important and implicated in the results. And also that there are quite strong variations by age and particularly by socioeconomic circumstances. So in other words, crime seems to have a an additional effect amongst groups from lower socioeconomic groups. So there are implications of neighbourhood crime for health inequalities, mental health inequalities. So there's one very brief taster of quite a lot of work. And if you don't mind moving on, please, Amy. And there's a few animations, if you don't mind just running through to the end of them. I forgot those are in here. So we've been working with some of our colleagues in the Lothian Birth Cohort, Simon Cox and Ian Deary, and also Catherine Ward and the Edinburgh College of Art. And we have a particular interest in the connections between place and mental health over the full human life course. And the Lothian Birth Cohort, which Lucy mentioned earlier rather handily, is a cohort of people in the Lothian region of Scotland, born in 1936, and for whom several waves of really rich data relating to their health, demography, socioeconomic circumstances, and lots of other information as well, have been collected during older age. And the data set, from our point of view, provides a unique opportunity to consider some really interesting questions about, for example, the example I'll share with you here is the example of green space and the role of green space throughout life in terms of affecting health much later on in life, in older age. So we're able to ask questions like, has there been a cumulative risk of exposure to green space throughout people's lives as a sort of accumulation right from birth through to older age? And or are there particular critical periods where green space seem to matter, particularly in terms of explaining mental health related outcomes in older age? And the work that we've published on this has shown, I think really quite interestingly, that childhood exposure to green space seems to have lifelong implications in terms of people's mental health, and also in terms of various cognitive aging related outcomes. So green space is much earlier in the life course. The kind of environments you live in childhood seem to have lasting impacts right through into much later on in life. So that's the second example. Now my final example, if you don't mind moving on, please, Amy. Thank you. We've been talking about green space and mental health. I'll stick with that theme for a moment. But this piece of work, which has been quite well picked up over the last few years, has been asking particularly around inequalities in mental health. And of course, as we saw earlier in one of the earlier slides, there is a very strong social gradient in terms of mental health outcomes. I'm sure most people are very familiar with much greater prevalence amongst more disadvantaged groups. And if you don't mind just running through these animations again. So we've been using European wide data to look at these questions. And as you can see from this graph here, just sort of giving a bit of a summary of the results, is that when we look at the relationship between socioeconomic circumstances along the x-axis here and a measure of mental health on the y-axis, that when we look across Europe, we see this very clear trend that we're all probably quite familiar with. Sorry, Amy, do you mind just going back to that? The gradient you can see is pretty consistent across all of the European countries. But if we could get that graph back up, what you've been able to see is that when we look at the relationship and we stratify it according to people's green spaces, that there is a shallower relationship, less inequalities in greener environments. So the greener environment that people live in, the narrower the health inequalities. So it shows, I think, that green space is not only a useful mechanism for understanding mental health and wellbeing outcomes, but it also helps to ameliorate inequalities in health. So that was my summary of some recent work that is interested in the connections between place and health. I focus particularly here on green space, but the group's been involved in a number of other projects looking at various aspects of place, which we're happy to pick up in questions or discussion later. So that's me, I think.
That's great. Sorry about the small technical difficulties.
No
Microsoft PowerPoint decided today's not the day. Unfortunately, sorry for that. I do apologise. Hopefully everybody else has got a chance to now see the graph in a little bit more detail, and we're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Jasmine Wirtz, if you're ready. If the PowerPoint will let me.
I was muted, sorry.
No problem at all.
Hi everyone, my name is Jasmin Wertz. I've actually only just moved to the University of Edinburgh as a lecturer in the Department of Psychology from Duke University in the US, where I did my postdoc. So I'm really excited about this opportunity to meet others who work in mental health research across the university. My work is mostly about the development of child and adolescent mental health problems and about the outcomes of these problems across the life course. And as part of that, I have recently completed this project where we tested whether young people's mental health problems would predict accelerated aging. So if you could move to the next slide, thank you. This paper is already published, and you can see the reference here. And then there's an animation, if you could click next. And the idea here was to test whether accelerated aging could explain some of the excess morbidity and mortality from age-related diseases such as heart disease and diabetes that we see in people with psychiatric disorders. And so as a first step, we tested this link here between psychiatric disorders and accelerated aging. If you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. To do this, we use data from the Dunedin study, which is a longitudinal cohort study based in New Zealand that has followed participants from birth to age 45. Thanks. Now, age 45 might strike you as quite young to study aging, but it's actually an ideal age because it's old enough that we can see quite a bit of variation in biomarkers of aging, but it's still years before the average age of onset of most age-related physical diseases, such as diabetes and heart disease. Mental health problems were, oh, sorry, not yet, but thanks. Mental health problems were assessed every couple of years from adolescence onwards. And we did not focus here on any one specific disorder, but we used a measure called the general psychopathology factor. And the easiest way to think of this is as a score for each individual person, where people who had more mental health disorder symptoms of any kind over the years have higher scores versus those with fewer symptoms. And now the next animation. Thanks. And as markers of aging, we focused on one measure in particular called the biological pace of aging. This is a combination of 19 biomarkers that were in this cohort measured from age 26 to age 45. And this has previously been validated to index the sort of physiological decline in tissue and organ function over the years. And it was also shown to predict age-related disease and earlier death. In addition to this measure, we also used measures of sensory and motor and cognitive function, for example, tests of hearing and vision, and tests of cognitive ability. All right, and then let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So here you can see the results, and this shows you the strength of the association between psychopathology and each of our outcomes. So the further to the right this bar is, the stronger the association. Now, we don't have much time, but you can easily see the main result here, which is that people with more psychopathology, so with higher scores on this psychopathology factor, were aging faster on virtually all of these indicators. So they had a faster biological pace of aging. They also had more sensory, motor, and cognitive difficulties. And then if you, yeah, right, there we go. So we saw this when we used objective lab tests of these outcomes, such as hearing tests, for example, but we also found the same result when we used participants' own self-reports of their functioning. So we asked them about their hearing difficulties, for example. And in fact, you can see that the magnitude here was even higher in the associations. I think there's one more animation. Right, so note that this controls for lots of variables. So for SES, for childhood maltreatment, it also importantly controls for childhood physical health and sensory, motor, and cognitive function. So we had all this data because this is a longitudinal study. We did also analyze more specific disorder types, and these results were very, very much the same when we looked at externalizing, internalizing, and thought disorders. So there didn't really seem to be much of a difference between these different types of disorders. And so for us, the takeaway messages here were that, so people with psychiatric problems early in life show accelerated aging. This is years before they would traditionally be thought of as old and be more likely to be diagnosed with well-known diseases of aging. And it is also very consistent across different indicators of aging. And so what we describe in the paper is that we think that this speaks to the importance of an integrated healthcare approach, which considers both mental and physical health. And also, if these associations do turn out to be causal, it would mean that besides the many other benefits of mental health care, it could also help reduce the massive burden of age-related disease nationally and globally across the world. All right, that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much for that, Jasmine. That was very interesting. And next up we have Liana. Liana, are you okay to share your screen?
I'm indeed, or at least I'll try. Let's see what happens. I hope you can see that.
Yep, I can see that.
So my name is Liana Romaniuk. I'm a clinical lecturer here in Edinburgh in child and adolescent psychiatry. So just a little bit about my background. I've come to psychiatry through a slightly peculiar route. I originally was trained in cybernetics, which is robotics and AI, and neuroinformatics, where my PhD focused on combining neuroimaging and computational modelling to get a slightly more mechanistic view of how illness develops and manifests. I'm also ST6 in child and adolescent psychiatry, currently working in our inpatient unit, which is a very busy place. And so just here's a bit of an outline about the themes running through the work that I'm trying to do now. So as I say, using these tools of computational modelling and neuroimaging, and where the emphasis is to really understand a little bit more about how beliefs within our mind, however we hold them, are formed, are stabilised, and more crucially can be changed over time. Regardless of pathology almost, you know, if you're talking about psychosis or depression or anorexia, it's those kind of fixed, really unhelpful beliefs that get in the way of their life and recovery. So, and especially during that time of adolescence, this is the time when so much that has cascading effects for the rest of our lives gets laid down. So having more of a sense of how difficult, you know, unhelpful beliefs can be, you know, amenable to therapy is hopefully very helpful. So it's about understanding how those things can be skewed in the context of particularly adversity. You know, what is it about adversity that tunes the system to do things in a slightly less helpful way, how that eventually evolves potentially into an illness, but also how, despite all the bad things, you know, the adversity, some people manage to maintain, you know, well-being, an adaptive way of living. And if we can understand a bit more about that, that will hopefully inform, you know, different therapeutic approaches. If we can take some of what's working for these people and try and make it more accessible to other people as well, that would be wonderful. This is a horrible, horrible slide, sorry. So this is the STRADL project, which I've been involved in, which is a large cohort of people drawn from Generation Scotland, with 1,000 people who have undergone some neuroimaging and much more besides. And the focus here was to, you know, see how to stratify people basically by their early life, childhood adversity, and to see the impact that that's having on them now in the context of having or not having depression, major depressive disorder. The task itself was one that we've adapted ourselves, where you're learning through trial and error, but sometimes you get to choose, personal choice, fantastic. And the other times you just have to do what the computer tells you to do. It's much more passive. So that gives us a way, you know, within the MRI scanner to see how the brain encodes values, you know, being able to make those choices, receiving those earned rewards, and applying Bayesian models to estimate how the brain might be responding based on their behavior, to estimate these, you know, key parameters about belief, precision and malleability over time, that kind of thing. So this is a very little snippet of some of the findings from that, which will be published soon, hopefully. Looking at those people who experienced emotional abuse as young people, and here on this axis we've got how that belief in the self, how that's been encoded in the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And you can see for the blue line, those people who remained well despite this emotional abuse as a child, they've got this kind of maintained belief in self within that part of the brain. Whereas for those who actually have become unwell at some point in their lives, you can see how that drops off with the adversity, and that's quite interesting. Going a little bit more into the kind of molecular biology aspect of that, if you look at the polygene risk score for depression, see how that impacts this process. You can see for those, the blue line there, they have a genetically low risk of depression in theory. And you can see that despite this emotional abuse, they've maintained that self-belief representation in right dorsolateral. Whereas for those who have a higher genetic risk, it's fallen away. So again, there's some more additional clues emerging from that. Just out of interest, this part of the brain is very much involved, multimodality in mental imagery. If you're imagining the future, the past, you know, things in your mind, then this is a part of the brain which quite specifically gets very excited. So there's some more mechanistic clues there, maybe. And just finally for this, within those who have at some point been depressed, looking at, you know, for those who've still maintained a really strong sense of autonomy despite having had illness, compared to those where it's not been so much the case. And we can see here that the way the dopamine parts of the brain respond to receiving their reward that they've earned, again, really varies depending on that level of autonomy and the abuse or the neglect, in this case, that they experienced in the past. So we've taken this into a group of adolescents. We had some funding to do a pilot study of some young people who had self-identified as having low mood, a kind of a subclinical sample. And we found a good replication of findings in adults. And again, these belief representations about the self, in this case the caudate nucleus, really co-varied with how severe the current depressive symptoms were in a very strong way. We also asked the question of how much perceived choice they felt they had in their own life, you know, and that's obviously partly environmental and partly dispositional. And again, really strong relationships with that. Really interestingly, we found that for those people who had a brain, you know, representation that you would associate with good mental health or low depressive symptoms, that wasn't the case if they had low perceived choice. That kind of abolished the effect. And I think that says a lot of stuff which is really important about a young person's environment, occupational therapeutic approaches, that kind of thing. If they don't have the opportunities, then actually the brain is overwhelmed by that. And finally, other things which are going on, we've got a wonderful PhD student, Gladdy, who's working, I'm a co-supervisor with Heather Worley and Shenji Yi. She's applying some excellent new approaches to large longitudinal data sets of teenagers. I'm the principal investigator for a multi-centre clinical trial run by Dennis Ugren down in KCL and now KNUL, looking at the impact of intensive community care on adolescents. Also working with Prof. Hong Han Wu and UCL, and Rowena Smith, she's one of our trainees, CAMS trainees, on natural language processing to try and pull crucial information about early life adversity from medical records that might otherwise just be lost and inaccessible. Working with Prof. James Kirkbride down in UCL again with Ian Proveny, general adult trainee, to try and apply his Bayesian models to our epidemiological data to predict how much demand, if we tried to create an early intervention for psychosis team, how much demand we might face in our area. And then finally, a clinical trial with Andrew Horn from Gynecology and Reproductive Sciences, of all things, to look at the impact of gabapentin on chronic pelvic pain within neuroimaging, which is, I think pain is a really interesting symptom viewed from a psychiatric perspective anyway. So I'll stop there and thank you. Stop sharing.
Thanks, Leanna, that's great. We're going to just move straight on to the next speaker, Pearson McCusker. So I'm just going to get your screen ready to go. There we go.
Okay, thanks very much, Amy. And hello, folks. I'm Pearson McCusker, Senior Lecturer in Social Work. It's lovely to be here and to share some of the research that colleagues and I have been doing recently. So I'm involved in a range of work spanning both preventative and more statutory approaches to mental health, including critical mindfulness and support for student and practitioner well-being. I'm currently leading a Principal Teachers Award Scheme project aimed at embedding self-care within the curriculum. And as you may know, there's lots of interdisciplinary work going on in this theme within the university and across higher education generally. But for this talk, I've chosen to outline a couple of projects on mental health and with care experienced young people. So if you could move to the next slide, Amy, thanks. And the reason for this choice is A, because quite a few of us within the social work subject area are involved in this realm of work, and B, because it highlights shared methodological interests across the team and beyond around co-production, creative methods and knowledge exchange. So in the first project, which is up here, it was a very small scale knowledge exchange study, and it involved care experienced young people from West Lothian and Glasgow who were co-researchers on the project. And the dual aims were firstly to hear about the challenges they faced in maintaining good mental health in care and what they believe needed to change. And secondly, to use this knowledge to influence practice in their local area. So the main findings were that beyond perhaps predictable challenges such as long waiting lists and for access to child and adolescent mental health services, the key things they felt would make a fundamental difference to their mental health were firstly building their relationships with other people. They saw this as central to countering experiences of fractured relationships, feelings of abandonment and lack of love and nurture. And the other was educating residential and social care staff to recognise the central importance of their roles in directly supporting the young people's mental health. So staff drawing on their own qualities and skills, especially in being there for the young people, being open to talking about mental distress. The young people observed that often care staff appeared to feel ill-equipped to really engage with them about this, and typically often referred on or tried to refer on to mental health services, possibly because they felt out of their depth. So we took these findings and with the young people co-developed a 2-hour online training workshop with an emphasis on using creative methods to capture the main messages as kind of creatively and viscerally as possible. So this included employing a sound engineer to record audio from the young people around case studies and themes, including suicidal ideation and self-harm. We then co-delivered this in 5 workshops to corporate parents, social workers, residential childcare workers, and social care students in the West Lothian area. And we're currently analysing the data, but the participants at the workshops appear to be overwhelmingly positive about the impact of the experience on their knowledge, and particularly having young people front and centre of the process, as the quote on the slide indicates. Also, importantly, the impact on the young people from participating in the project was extremely powerful in a number of ways, including building confidence, self-efficacy, and skills in researching and presenting, which in one young person's case was exemplified by him going on to independently develop another training project, this time with the police, which he said he wouldn't have had the skills or confidence to do previously. And the young people are also currently involved in co-writing the 2 papers from the study. And we were able to draw on this experience of co-production in a second larger interdisciplinary project led by our colleague, Professor John Devaney, which sought to agree and identify a research agenda for the mental health and well-being of care experienced young people. This centred on the young people exploring questions around mental health and neurodiversity. And in essence, they emphasise the importance of holistic understandings of mental health, how past and current experiences and environments influence their mental health. These included unhealthy relationships, not feeling listened to, poverty, chaotic and stressful environments. So many themes that are evident in the other presentations that you've heard from today. They also stress the importance of being directly involved in assessment and planning processes, and we're very critical of standardised mental health assessment and outcome measures, finding them impersonal, blunt, and ultimately inadequate for capturing the reality of their experiences. And overall, they emphasise the need to achieve systemic change and criticise the mental health system for focusing on symptoms without seeing the person and their journey in context, and for being crisis-driven rather than preventative. So just to sum up with a final point, that hopefully both of these projects help to highlight the potential of co-production in mental health research. Again, you've heard more about this on other colleagues' presentations today, and there's a lot of really interesting work going on in this area. I just want to mention the Binks Hub, which my colleague Dr. Autumn Marsh is involved in, which is looking at co-production and creative methods, and it's just getting off the ground. Obviously, co-production brings challenges and raises ethical questions, but notwithstanding these, I think Edinburgh Mental Health could be a really valuable platform for further developing this approach across the range of interdisciplinary mental health research that will hopefully result from it. Thank you very much.
That's great, Pierce. Thank you so much. And our final speaker for these flash talks of this round, we have Sinead. I really hope I've said that right. Here we go.
Thanks, Amy. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so my name is Sinead Rhodes and I'm a Senior Research Fellow in CCPS and the Centre for Child Life and Health. And I'm also the Academic Lead for Public Engagement for Neurosciences. I'm a developmental psychologist and my research focuses on neurodevelopmental disorders. I'm particularly interested in cognitive function and mental health and their interrelationship. So today I'm going to be briefly giving you an overview of some of the flavour of my work, which focuses on understanding, appropriate measurement and supporting the mental health of children and young people with neurodevelopmental disorders. Next slide, please, Amy. I do research across quite a number of neurodevelopmental disorders, autism, ADHD and DCD dyspraxia. We know with these disorders there's a really high increased prevalence of mental health difficulties, and my research mainly is focused on depression. We see across all of these disorders a rate of 1 in 2 people receiving a diagnosis across the lifespan. Another important characteristic, though, is also that we see an earlier onset of depression symptoms in these populations. So typically in the kind of samples that I've been looking at, we see onset of depression symptoms in middle childhood and adolescence. We've conducted a study to look at to really characterize the subjective experience of depression in these groups. And in particular, I'm going to speak about a study that we've conducted with autistic children and adolescents. And we found quite a number of important insights with this study. Firstly, that in terms of precipitating factors, challenging peer relationships were a key factor here. And of course, depression then leads these children to socially withdraw further, thus exacerbating the situation. And what we found was that these children and their parents reported that the children and adolescents really had a huge difficulty reconnecting with their peers when their depression lifted. We found some interesting findings in relation to the children referring to hiding, or specifically some refer to masking their depression symptoms. Now, this is particularly important because we know that for many autistic people, they mask their autism symptoms. And we know that that's associated with increased risk of mental health difficulties. So we're almost seeing a double whammy here. And the children and adolescents reported that they felt fatigued by masking the depression. So for many of these autistic people, they're facing a double whammy of potentially hiding both depression and autistic symptoms. I think this is an area that is very much worth future research to address the impact. We also found an autism-specific characteristic in relation to food, and we obviously know that altered eating is associated with depression, but this was a slightly different indicator in this group. Many children and young people with autism have a very restricted diet. I don't mean in terms of volume necessarily, but in terms of the type or the number of food that they eat. And what we found was that the children and young people and their parents commented that they further restricted their diets in terms of the type, not just the amount, when they were going through a depressive episode. This research involves a multidisciplinary team. The particular research I've just described involves psychiatrists, speech and language therapy, and developmental and clinical psychologists. And in a parallel study, I'm looking at puberty in children with neurodevelopmental disorders, and this involves a gynecologist academic based here at Edinburgh. Next slide, please. One of the major difficulties that is limiting the advancement of research into mental health in neurodevelopmental disorders is the measures used. Most of them have been developed with the typically developing population, and this is particularly true of child and adolescent samples. And there's a whole range of difficulties with this in terms of their suitability. We've heard a lot today about co-production, whether they're acceptable to that population, whether the items are acceptable, but in particular, confounds or overlap. So there are many symptoms of these developmental disorders, like social withdrawal in autism and concentration in ADHD and dyspraxia, that overlap with depression symptoms. So our interdisciplinary group have developed the Neurodevelopmental Depression Inventory, parent and child versions, and we co-produce this with young people, their parents, and with professionals who work with these young people. We asked the young people about their understanding and appropriate wording for items in relation to that. And just by way of an example, a common depression screener item is "I feel empty." The autistic participants in our sample referred to that as meaning "I feel hungry," because they take things, very literally and concretely. Really, one of the main things we've done in this project is focus on change. Not all depression screeners focus on change, some partially do. It's particularly true of child screeners. So we have a real focus on change to avoid these kind of confounds. Next slide. So this is my last slide. It's an intervention that I've developed called the Edinburgh Psychoeducation Intervention for Children and Young People, or EPIC, as it's now become known. This is not specifically a mental health intervention. It's been developed to look at the symptoms of neurodevelopmental disorders, and in particular looking at aspects of cognitive function and emotional regulation. And we know obviously these are very important aspects for mental health. This project involves a research intervention that we've been developing and have now done the first phase of testing. At the heart of EPIC is psychoeducation. And what I mean by that is actually understanding the individual child's specific strengths and difficulties around a range of areas, but particularly around cognition, emotional regulation and well-being. And psychoeducation involving the child, parent and teacher, so everyone understanding that individual child. And initial findings suggest the research intervention is associated with significant improvements in cognition and emotion regulation. And in the next phase of the research, which we're just about to start, we are now including more specific direct measures of well-being and mental health. Thanks for listening.
That was great. Thank you so much, Sinead. Thank you to all of our speakers in this second round of our flash talks. And we have about 20 minutes for some questions. I think people have kind of been chatting away in the chat about various interesting conferences and things like that people might be interested in. And I think we do have a question in the chat for Pierce, but Pierce already typing away an answer, so you can continue typing or feel free to speak it out loud. It's totally up to you. I will just stop sharing this so that people can chat away.
Thanks, Amy. Yes, really interesting question from Aruna about where lack of space might actually be associated with default support systems for people with psychosocial disabilities. I have to be honest, I don't have direct experience of it myself, but in some senses it makes sense in relation to having a social network, a ready-made social network that and certainly some of the young people that we've worked with who have care experience don't have as much certainly ready access to. So this is for Jamie Pierce. Sorry, Jamie, are you, or Jamie, do you want to come in?
Sorry, I'm lost. Which question we referring to here?
Jamie, don't know.
This first question here, I'll read it out for you. So hope I'm not oversimplifying, but have you noticed situations where lack of space, i.e. people living in close quarters in urban spaces in the global south, might actually be associated with default support systems for people with psychosocial disabilities. I noticed this while doing community mental health work in Northern India. Thank you.
So I guess our work hasn't been in the global south, is the first thing to say. There has been, I guess, a lot of work looking at different aspects of geography, including things like residential density and the implications of that. And it's definitely right, it's a mixed picture. Residential density comes with, higher residential density comes with lots of positive aspects of health, including better services, broadly a better infrastructure. So it is a complex picture. But I think trying to tease some of these things apart is really useful. A lot of the green space work tries to take account for some of the other aspects, and it tends to quite consistently show that green spaces are beneficial for people at all different stages of the life course. There's research we've done, for example, looking at children's development in very early ages, and again, green spaces seem to be really beneficial from that, and right through to encouraging older residents in terms of physical activity, social participation, and so on. So absolutely, these things, there's a complex picture, but I think trying to pull them apart is quite helpful.
Thank you. A couple other questions have just kind of popped up. So Sinead, this one is for you. So interested in your talk. Thank you. Have you come across the early positive approaches to support, which is parenting for parents under 5s? This has been developed by the Tizard Centre, ties into the significance of self-image and early parenting. At present, parenting courses offered don't reflect intellectual disabilities. Would you agree?
I forgot about the mute. Yeah, it's kind of not really my research area. So my research area is really from primary school age, and not specifically to intellectual disabilities. But I am very aware of the approach that you've mentioned, and yeah, would agree with you.
Okay, so I've got a question this time for Pierce McCusker. In your work, have you encountered youth that come from cultures where it is natural to defer to authority figures, i.e. older people? If so, how does one ensure that their participation is safeguarded? Thanks.
I haven't actually encountered youth who have kind of deferred, if you like, to authority or professionals. That's an interesting question, and it's one that we should maybe think about more clearly. But generally speaking, we take a lot of time and effort to prepare the young people, for working in the projects, to explain what co-production is about, to find out what their interests are, and to really kind of ensure that they feel, as far as possible, that they are speaking honestly. And I'd have to say, certainly working with care experienced young people, that I found them very willing and able to speak very frankly and honestly. But still, it's a good point, and one that merits further consideration.
Thank you. Another question for Jamie from the Q&A chat. What types of data are needed to measure green space or amounts of crime in a local area? Is it based on self-report of where people have lived or worked, or are you collecting this information by tracking locations through smartphones?
The brief answer is all of the above. So I guess the self-reported data is generally seen as being, perhaps slightly more problematic. Self-reported green space and mental health, there may be some issues around reverse causation and so on there. We've collected data from all sorts of sources. So a very common way in the literature is from remote sensing data and using vegetation indices as an indicator of green space. There are other ways that it's been done historically. So often, some of the work we've been trying to do historically, of course, in order to do that properly, you need green space data right back to, well, in our case, sort of 1930s or 1940s. And the way we've done that is through historical maps, historical survey maps, and scanning and extracting information from that. But for more contemporary data, more contemporary analyses, which that wouldn't be able to answer the questions that I was posing earlier, but nonetheless give important information about sort of current uses of green space. And so some of the work during the COVID period has been really good for this. We've seen using GPS track data, mobile phone data, and so on, able to look at the ways in which people use their green spaces, and during the pandemic use them quite differently. So they're all quite they're excellent data for asking some slightly different questions, perhaps not so useful some of the more sort of epidemiological long-term analyses, but nonetheless very valuable for understanding current mobility patterns and implications of green space use, which is a slightly different question.
That's great, thank you. We haven't had any more kind of questions or anything come up, so I think I'm just going to hand it over to submit. Just give me 1 second. Oh. Submit, are you still here?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me okay? Hold on. My Zoom has just crashed. Give me a second.
No worries.
Looks fine to me.
Yeah, it's fine now. I just got a message saying it crashed, but I think it's okay. That's good. Just slightly worried. Anyway, thanks very much, Amy, and what a really wonderful set of talks we've had this afternoon. My name is Sumit Jain. I'm a senior lecturer in social work in the School of Social and Political Science. I'm also the program director for the MSc in Global Mental Health and Society, which is a jointly run MSc between social work, clinical psychology, and colleagues in social anthropology. A lot of my own work has been in the area of global mental health and looking at issues around cross-cultural mental health, and I particularly do a lot of work in South Asia, particularly in India and Nepal, in the area of community mental health and looking at looking at the capacities of communities and community-based programs. It's been really nice to hear the range of presentations today. I'm just going to very briefly, and not going to take up too much more of our time. It's been a long afternoon. But if you just give some summary thoughts and think about some next steps in terms of ways forward, next steps for EMH. I think what's been really interesting this afternoon, and I'm not going to try and sort of summarize the presentations because there's been some really excellent presentations, but it's been really nice to see this process of coming together and talking about our research in short bursts and hearing about different methods, different approaches, different contexts. Some things which at times I found challenging to sort of engage with because of my own lack of knowledge, and some things which you could more easily engage with. But thinking about the connections between this has been really interesting, and I guess a few things came to mind as we sort of think as we develop environmental health, and one of the things that came to mind was this real value in doing this and coming together, but also what is interdisciplinarity, which is one of the aims of EMH, as Danny was outlining. What does that mean for the network in practice? For example, how might different ways of measurement and more broadly methods help us to better understand particular challenges? And I think one of the aims within the EMH is to think about challenge-led themes, and I'll speak about that in a moment. But how do we do that in practice? How do we bring our different ways of looking at, of understanding the world, bring those together to bear on particular challenges? And that's something we'll be talking a bit more about in the event on March 28th. Similarly, in terms of interdisciplinarity, I was also thinking a lot about the categories we use and the word used in the presentations, and we come at this and think about, say, for example, the category depression and how that might mean different things in different disciplines, and how do we deliberate on those differences as we work together in the process of developing productive research agendas. I think that's something we need to think about. The second big question that emerged as I was listening to the talks was about the value of doing this, the value of doing this for ourselves as individual researchers, but also the value of doing this more collectively in terms of addressing sort of societal challenges, and something that I think something that's really important for this network as we go forward is how do we address the societal challenges around mental health, and I guess how do we each of us find value in this sort of a network as it develops. And I think that's something that hopefully in the we can come to discussing in the meeting on March 28th. And I'll talk about the agenda for that in a moment. The third question, which again links to the agenda for March the 28th, is about processes as well. And it's been really interesting when we had to pivot this meeting to an online meeting. And I've been at workshops like this where we've been in person. And it's interesting doing it online, how it opens up to a wider audience, which has been really interesting. We've had people from here from different parts of the world who've been posing, really interesting questions and challenging questions. And what do we lose, and so what do we lose in different sorts of spaces? So how do we go about doing this sort of networking? But also it's been interesting at the sub level of networking that's been going on in the chat, which sometimes isn't really available so much in a more open way in a in-person format. So there's something about sort of thinking about how we go about engaging and networking and speaking to each other and learning from each other as we go forward, and how we sort of alternate and move between different types of methods. Okay, so that's just sort of my broad reflections, and others may have other things that you're reflecting on. Please feel free to share those in the chat if you have other reflections. This is sort of my sort of 2 or 3 things I was thinking about as the presentations went on. I want to just move on to just talk about next steps, because this relates to some of the things I was just mentioning. If we could just move to the next slide, Amy. Yeah.
It should be there.
Oh, it should be there. Okay, I don't see it, but that's fine. It might be my Zoom is still frozen. So the oh, okay, yeah. The as we mentioned at the outset, then the sort of in-person. The next step is an in-person conference on March the 28th. And I guess the next event, and I guess one thing I just want to emphasize before I go on is to say that we're very much at the consultation phase of developing Edinburgh mental health, and as Danny also emphasized, this is a really good point at which people can input in and bring ideas to the table, think about the purpose, the structure, the governance of the network as we move forward. And one of the things we'll be doing is trying to go to take our thinking a bit deeper into around EMH, and particularly part of the day on the 28th will be devoted to consultations on the structure, governance, and purpose of EMH, which Professor Sue Fletcher-Watson will be leading on. I think Sue might be here in the room, but will be leading on in terms of organizing those consultations. And we'll have an online survey to complement that, for not everyone may not be able to make it into the room on the 28th. But that's going to be a really important part of the day, to be thinking about, well, what's the purpose of this for everyone? What value can it bring to people? How do we go about doing this? And obviously we'll be bringing some ideas to the table as well, based on other sort of cross-college networks in the university that are currently functioning, how they have functioned, but trying to think about what would work best for our community, so to speak. The other key aspect on the 28th will be to ask the question, what are some of the key interdisciplinary challenge-led themes that we might initially prioritize? And some of those have come up today, and there'll be others, but to have discussions about sort of what are the areas where there may already be some work going on, and maybe useful to sort of build those further, areas where there's potential for work, and to be thinking about those challenge-led themes. And finally, I guess one of the key elements of today, but also on the 28th, we'll be thinking about networking and facilitating networking, but also facilitating sharing of research, as we've done today through these sort of flash talks. And it did occur to me that actually it'd be really nice to have some of these flash talks up on the EMH website as well, as ways of sharing this more widely in the community, in the university community, and more widely. So that's the sort of third element of the day on the 28th. So I want to also just mention that, and Danny sort of hinted at this at the beginning, we're also starting a mapping process of mapping the range of expertise around mental health and well-being across the university. We have an RA who'll be joining in the next couple of weeks to start undertaking this work over the next several months. So we would be mapping out, who's doing mental health and wellbeing research across the 3 colleges. What type of work are they doing? What are the methods they're using? What are the disciplines underpinning their work? And this is really to help facilitate collaboration and facilitate cross and interdisciplinary collaboration as well. So you may well be contacted at some point by the RA or by ourselves to participate in that process of mapping. We'll be using initially, drawing on people's profiles and using Pure and other systems to try and build an initial database, but there'll be gaps that we need to be filled in, and people may be contacted directly around that. Just want to pick up, there's a couple of comments in the question comments. Yeah, so someone has mentioned it'd be nice to bring other partners into the conversation, especially from different parts of the world, Malawi, India. This will help present tandem narratives and also complete the picture of what research and practice partnerships look like. I think that's a really important point from Aruna Raman, who's based in India, about sort of bringing in our community partners, our collaborators locally and globally into the conversation. I think that's certainly one of the aims with Edinburgh Mental Health, is to try and is to further solidify those bridges, but also to sort of ensure there's a cross communication as well. Yeah, so I just want to end, I guess, with two things. Please let your colleagues know about the network and about the next event. So please spread the word in your schools, in your units, departments. And also just want to ask Amy and Danny, is there anything else either of you want to add at this stage?
Thanks, Sumit. No, I guess just I'd like to thank all the speakers for this afternoon. And also anyone who's registered for this conference will be getting emails from us around feedback for today, but also areas that they work in, and also suggestions for us following up as a group. So look out for an email communication from us in the next week or so, probably. But otherwise, just thanks to Amy mostly for handling this afternoon brilliantly. With about 10 days notice, Amy's kind of pulled this together. So it's fantastic, really good. And just to say, as Sumit said, this is at the early stages, and we're very open to hearing what people want out of the network. And I guess my focus is all about helping younger members of the community doing this type of work develop grant ideas, fellowship ideas, building capacity for the future and that kind of thing. But I can already see multiple intersecting areas of research just from all the flash talks. So I'm hoping this will be really productive, and I think it's hopefully a win-win for everyone. But I'm happy to stop there. Amy, if you want to say anything at the end.
I think all I've got left to say has kind of already been said, but again, thank you to everyone that has attended for today. Please keep a wee eye out for our email following our feedback and things like that. We'd love to hear what you think of today and any suggestions that you have for the March conference coming up. We'd really like to see you all there, hopefully in person. And also thank you so much to all of the speakers for today. The flash talks were extremely interesting, and it was just great to see all the different areas of mental health research and how they just, without any pre-planning, how much we all overlap with each other, referring back to each other's talks, and just to see that we're already connected in some way, and now we just need to make it that little bit more official. So thank you again to everyone who has attended, and as I mentioned before, please send us any emails, tweets, any research of yours that you want us to share. If you have some fantastic figures that you'd love us to tweet about, anything like that at all, please feel free to drop me an email with any questions you have about the network, and anything else you would like to let us know, any feedback or anything at all would be fantastic. So thank you all so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Cheers.